Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. Flight has always been a fascinating feat that only few animals have ever achieved. Insects were, of course, the first, but since then there have been a few others as well, including modern-day birds and bats. But in the past, there's been even more, and one of those groups includes the pterosaurs, flying reptiles that flew and roamed this earth along with the dinosaurs. A fascinating group indeed. And although they're known as cousins of the dinosaurs, they seem to be significantly less well known. For example, I always thought that a pterodactyl was a type of dinosaur, but no, they're pterosaurs. And maybe it was just me who thought that, but I wanted to learn a bit more about this very fascinating group of incredible creatures. And speaking of incredible creatures, I chose to research a pterosaur which had a wingspan of over 36 feet, was over 18 feet tall, the height of a giraffe, and had a beak which was over 8 feet long. That creature is none other than the Quetzalcoatlus northropi, a pterosaur which thrived during the Cretaceous period between 144 and 66 million years ago. Now, before we get to talking about that creature specifically, I think it's a good idea to talk about the pterosaurs as a whole. So let's do that. As I said earlier, the pterosaurs are extinct flying reptiles that range from 50 centimeters to 13 meters in wingspan, so quite a large range indeed. They thrived during the Mesozoic era, the same time as dinosaurs, throughout the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous time periods. The pterosaurs were not a well-documented group, as their fossil record is about 1/10 the size of that of the dinosaurs. This is mostly due to the fact that pterosaurs had hollow bones, which were easily dissolved into the ground as time passed. The most prominent feature of pterosaurs is, of course, their ability to fly. They had a wing membrane made of specialized tissue layers, stretched from an elongated finger back to their bodies, which allowed powered flight, something I'll talk about later. Now, there were two major groups of pterosaurs: the rhamphorhynchoids, which were generally small, with broad wings, short necks, and a long tail, and the pterodactyloids, which arose later and were the opposite, with a large size, narrow wings, long necks and skulls, and short tails. The pterodactyloids have also produced known footprints, suggesting that they were able to walk on land, like what you saw in the intro sequence of this video. The pterosaurs are overall a vastly diverse group, kind of like how the dinosaurs were. The main sources of variety were in their size, beaks, teeth, skulls, necks, wings, legs, and feet, and even more. And the largest pterosaurs were actually the largest flying animals of all time, which is quite interesting. Now that we've talked a bit more about pterosaurs, let's dive more deeply into the Quetzalcoatlus and what made it so unique from the other pterosaurs. Hey there. The Quetzalcoatlus northropi was a pterodactyloid pterosaur, but more specifically, it was part of the Azhdarchid group, the group of pterosaurs which produced the largest known flying animals of all time. Its name comes from the Mesoamerican deity Quetzalcoatl, probably to signify this animal's otherworldly features. I mean, just look at this creature. The beast had an extremely long neck, small torso, long legs, and relatively short wings compared to the length of its body. They likely acted as vultures, scavenging the remains of a deceased dinosaur or other larger animal. And boy, could they fly. Estimates believe that the Quetzalcoatlus had the ability to fly up to 128 kilometers per hour. In addition, they were able to travel 643 kilometers a day. How could these animals do this? Well, to answer that question, we need to look at the anatomy of the pterosaurs and what allowed them to be able to fly so effectively. Hey there. To truly understand the Quetzalcoatlus, it's important to first talk a little bit about their anatomy. The Azhdarchids, the pterosaur group which featured the Quetzalcoatlus, had quite unique skeletal designs. First of all, their limbs and heads were extremely large in comparison to their torsos. To try to offset the additional weight of these huge heads, the skulls contained massive openings, which greatly decreased the overall weight, as seen in this picture. As another measure to help decrease weight, the bones of pterosaurs were pneumatic, or hollow, and filled with air to increase the overall strength of the skeleton without increasing too much weight. In addition, Quetzalcoatlus featured enlarged sternums and fused shoulder blades to allow for plenty of muscle attachment so they could generate enough power to fly. In terms of respiration, Quetzalcoatlus probably had a similar system to that of modern-day birds, with air sacs in their hollow bones allowing air to travel in only one direction throughout the body, thus raising the efficiency of each breath. The GIF here shows it pretty well. The surface of the Quetzalcoatlus's wings was made of a membrane structure of muscle, skin, blood vessels, and fibers, while the wing itself was suspended from an enlarged fourth digit, the long finger seen in this image here. The surface was thin, but filled with specialized tissues that allowed them to withstand any external pressures that may have come about while flying through the air. The skin of the Quetzalcoatlus featured small hair-like follicles which primarily served as insulation, like the hair seen in this image, but may have had a secondary role in display, although there's been no significant evidence of any extravagant coloration among the Quetzalcoatlus. All of this is cool and all, but how did the Quetzalcoatlus actually fly? I mean, it's huge, weighs around 250 kilograms, and only has these relatively small membrane structures on its arms. Well, it ties back to these animals' strength and power, as well as the anatomy that I just talked about. First of all, it should be noted that pterosaurs were the very first vertebrates to ever evolve flight, so what they achieved had never been done before. That being said, their elastic wings combined with extremely powerful muscles in both the shoulder and the torso were a big help for their ability to fly. This allowed them to be very maneuverable and agile in the air. In addition, the Quetzalcoatlus and other pterosaurs had smaller membrane surfaces in between their hind legs. These helped support their legs during flight and also helped allow for tighter maneuvers. This membrane can be seen here, connected between the tail and each hind leg. The Quetzalcoatlus also featured rounded wings, rather than ones with sharp tips, as rounded wings help prevent stall that occurs in wings that are too sharp. And another important feature was that the Quetzalcoatlus especially had a much longer wing than it did wide, allowing for excellent gliding. Now, how did this animal actually take off? It was massive, so it must have needed some power. Well, this power it got from its forelimbs. In modern-day birds, you can see that larger ones tend to have larger rear limbs to help them carry their weight. But since the Quetzalcoatlus was a quadruped when on land, its forelimbs became much stronger to allow it to take off. Estimates predict that due to its massive forearms, the Quetzalcoatlus could take off from flat ground with no wind in less than a second. Here's a quick video to demonstrate the process. Now that we've explored the anatomy and flight capabilities of the Quetzalcoatlus, the natural next question is, how did this animal interact with its environment? Well, it's funny you should ask that. The Quetzalcoatlus was mostly unique from other pterodactyloids, in that it was largely an inland creature. Rather than flying over oceans like other pterosaurs, this one stayed inland and did most of its scavenging there. Speaking of scavenging, it's important to understand what exactly this creature ate to appreciate how it interacted with its environment. Although most pterosaurs focused on the feeding of fish, the Quetzalcoatlus instead settled for inland prey, often in the forms of small terrestrial animals, and perhaps the occasional fish in the stream. Why do I put quotes around small? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The size of the Quetzalcoatlus would allow it to eat animals up to the size of small dinosaurs if it so pleased. The Quetzalcoatlus used its huge beak to snatch up prey, and because it didn't have any teeth, it relied on its stomach for food processing. They also occasionally fed on carrion, or the dead carcasses of other animals, as I mentioned earlier. Now, was the Quetzalcoatlus a social creature? Research suggests yes, they were, as darkids have typically been found near one another, pointing to the fact that multiple Quetzalcoatlus likely form small hunting groups while searching for prey on land. In addition, the Quetzalcoatlus may have featured elaborate head crests, developed in maturity as a form of social display, but this is not completely certain. Now, as you've seen throughout this video, pterosaurs were capable of quadrupedal motion on the ground, with a distinct erect stance rather than sprawled. The finger that held most of their wing was folded up, while the rest of their digits were used as weight bearers. Due to the sheer size of the Quetzalcoatlus, its terrestrial locomotion undoubtedly had some sort of impact on the terrain it walked on and the environments it passed through, possibly even transporting seeds and encouraging biodiversity. One interesting thing to note about the pterosaurs in general is that unlike other flying animals, these creatures grew up flying. Other animals could only achieve flight once they reached adulthood, but pterosaurs started flying at a very young age. Baby pterosaurs search for food on their own, meaning that they fill a different niche in the ecosystem than their later adult forms did. Overall, the Quetzalcoatlus was a social, baby dinosaur-eating, land-roaming, fast-flying beast with an incredibly unique anatomy that allowed it to thrive in the sky and on the ground throughout the Cretaceous period. I think we can agree that the Quetzalcoatlus was a beast to behold, with its massive stature and fascinating capabilities. We may think to ourselves that it's quite sad these creatures are no longer with us. But then we think again about how large these animals were and how easily they could have picked us up and threw us around. In the end, the Quetzalcoatlus, along with its pterosaur brothers and sisters, was wiped out during the end Cretaceous extinction event. One interesting possibility is that birds actually began to outcompete the pterosaurs toward the end of the Cretaceous, thus decreasing the biodiversity of the pterosaurs and making them more prone to extinction. This is unconfirmed, but is interesting to consider nonetheless. It's truly fascinating to think that these creatures roamed the same Earth that we now dominate. Would we still be this dominant if pterosaurs were still around? Who knows, but I really hope you learned something from this video. Catch you on the flippity flop. See ya!